Dr. Chair, for this kind of introduction, and thank you, Doctors Calvary and Johnson, for making this happen. Right, it's a wonderful event, and it's an honor for me to share with you insights into what I hope will become one day my third book. Now, this conference looks at commodities, trade, and materiality in the global Cold War. So let me begin my talk by discussing exactly this: commodities, trade, and materiality, all that in relation to the Cold War. And then I will build a bridge to knowledge and its urban landscapes in the Soviet Union. To that end, a short horror story. A Russian translation of my recent book, The Things of Life, Materiality in Late Soviet Russia, was about to be published in Moscow last year when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which made it the worst possible moment for the publication of a scholarly book. But the translation was already finished, so the publisher decided to go ahead with the publication and commission the design, a cover design for the translation. And this is what the designer sent me initially. Those of you who read or even skimmed my book, or even if you look at the table of contents, you would immediately see that the designer's choice of objects had nothing to do with the objects I discussed in it. I quickly sent an email to the editor saying that it's better to publish this without a cover than with this monster. And to give them due credit, they did not insist on keeping this design, but rather reutilize the design from the original American edition from Cornell. Nevertheless, the original choice of objects for the cover was very symptomatic. The designer apparently used his first associations with the word things in the title of the book, and here we are: the kolbasa, a luxury car, and a pack of bubblegums. That is the items that are strongly associated with the infamous Soviet deficit, like deficit or shortage of commodities and services that ranged from personal cars and housing through everyday products such as clothes to many food items such as sausages and the bubblegum. The deficit comes up almost every time someone starts a discussion of socialist consumption and planned economy, so it was barely surprising that the cover designer decided that the best way to illustrate a book about socialist materiality would be by throwing in some deficit items. Indeed, in the Soviet Union, one could wait for years in a line to get new furniture or a voucher for a tourist trip to Bulgaria. Fashion shoes, meat products, and fresh fruits, spotting your plumber's schedule. Ronald Reagan had to tell a joke about it. Even toilet paper, the list of things that were not readily available for Soviet consumers on store shelves can go on and on and on. At the same time, there was one commodity that was in abundance in the USSR, especially since the 1950s onwards. And that commodity was popular scientific, medical, political, historical, and many other forms of knowledge. It could be a challenge to buy many things, but if you wanted to educate yourself in space exploration or a healthy lifestyle or the Marxist-Leninist critique of imperialism or the military history of Russia, there was a variety of sources to draw knowledge from, which made knowledge part of the of Soviet everyday reality, the bit. And before I move on, let me clarify the meaning of the term bit, because I'm going to be using this in this talk quite a lot. Bit is a way of speaking about the everyday life that emphasizes its organizing principles. It became a key notion in the 1920s in the Soviet Union when the Bolsheviks and their fellow travelers discovered that the change ownership of the means of production from private to collective did not automatically transform the working class consciousness, because the structures of everyday life provided plenty of shelter for petty bourgeois attitudes. Leon Trotsky's famous article that later became a title of his English language book, The Problems of Everyday Life, was actually titled The Questions of the Bit, Vопросы быта, because Trotsky and many other Bolsheviks were attentive to and wanted to change the organizing principles of daily life that structured these daily experiences in post-revolutionary Russian society. Back in the 1920s, there were vibrant debates about how to change these principles of everyday life, how to change the bit of the Soviet people. During the Cold War, the Soviet political and academic establishment emphasized knowledge as something that had to produce rational, responsible, and disciplined Soviet citizens. Late Soviet bookstores represent an exemplary case to illustrate this point. While they often fail to satisfy the huge demand for a fiction book by popular authors, their shelves were nevertheless never empty. When you enter the local bookstore called Kalevala in one of the residential neighborhoods of Petrozavodsk, an urban center of North Russia, and one of the fields where I'm studying for my current research project, there were several departments to explore. Here you see a section with children's fiction and textbooks. Here's general fiction. Separate sections for books by authors from the socialist bloc on the right. And on the left, books published in the Finnish language, since Karelia was a bilingual republic. Most of the titles in this department were locally produced. Some of them were original Finnish language books written by Karelian or Finnish authors. Others were translations from Russian. A huge selection of political and ideological literature. And last but not least, a whole section of popular science titles. Geography-wise, stores like this sold books published both by central and local publishers, including academic presses. Quite a few of those titles were published by the Petrozavodsk University Press. Going on a shopping spree in Kalevala or in a similar store in the late 1970s could enrich your home library with books such as a Russian translation of Charles Darwin's The Voyage of the Beagle, or a 2-volume source book on the Communist International, or a college textbook on general psychology, or a guide to local mushrooms, or an anthology of Soviet Finnish poetry. These were just a few titles out of thousands available around that time through the Soviet book trade. Now, what should we as scholars of socialist society make out of this imaginary trip to a Soviet bookstore? Again, sure, the good old deficit argument can still explain what we saw in terms of, that most of the books in that store were low in demand, poor in quality, full of stupid ideology, while it was still impossible to get the good books everyone wanted. Yet, look at these Soviet apartment interiors, one from a popular Soviet film and another preserved almost unchanged from the 1980s. Books have several functions in both images, most importantly, performing social class of their owners, but setting that aside in a straightforward, positivist manner, we can also say that their owners, as well as millions of book lovers across the Soviet Union, did find Soviet bookstores good enough to stack up their bookshelves like this. Now, bookstores are just one example of a complex infrastructure of knowledge that Soviet urbanites and, to a lesser extent, residents of the Soviet countryside had access to during the Cold War. And in my talk today, I suggest that in order to understand the material world of socialism and how this material world shaped the social and cultural life in socialist societies, it would be productive to put on hold their explanations in terms of commodity shortages. Once again, it's not that there were no shortages. Definitely that was an integral part of lived experience in socialist societies. The problem is that the deficit framework also tends to monopolize all conversations about socialist materiality, not in this conference, luckily, and discard other, no less important aspects of consumption and materiality in the state socialism. In addition, this deficit framework emerged in the historical and cultural conditions of the Cold War as an ideological critique of socialism that assumed rather unquestionably the ultimate superiority of the free market economic model driven by consumer demands, but de facto by consumer desires. Since that time, however, we came to a realization that this economic model has been responsible for the current environmental degradation, for increasing divide between the first and third world that might be not visible here in Vienna, but is visible in many other places, and the global impoverishment of marginalized and working class communities. Think of the recent water supply crisis in Flint, Michigan. This realization provides us with an opportunity to rethink the materiality of state socialist societies, not simply in terms of shortages, but rather as an alternative modernist project that aimed to create a material environment that could promote rational slightly forms of consumption, and through that would foster egalitarian forms of life. A project that failed, yet we can still learn something valuable from it. Sergei Ushakin, who is present here accidentally, In his groundbreaking article against the cult of things published in 2014, that's almost 10 years ago. Time flies, right? Trace the genealogy of this effort to the productivist ethos of early Soviet avant-gardists such as Boris Arbatov, something that he mentioned, he discussed in his talk yesterday. My intention in my talk today is to examine how this modernist egalitarian effort manifests itself in the organization of the material infrastructure of the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign. So to that end, I will start with a kind of general overview of this campaign, the goal of which was very explicitly to produce a universal scientific literacy among the Soviet population. And then I will examine how this effort translated into a massive infrastructure program that had a visible impact on Soviet urban landscapes. So the year is 1947. The Second World War is barely over. The tensions between the socialist and capitalist blocs are building up, soon translating into the Cold War. And the Soviet Union looks like a very unlikely place to witness the launch of a science communication campaign that would become the largest of its kind in the 20th century. The devastation brought by Nazi Germany and its allies required immense capital investments. Then large parts of the country were hit by famine. Then anti-Soviet resistance was too strong in Western Ukraine and Lithuania. And now the building up of tensions with the United States added up an additional burden on Soviet economy. There was nothing even remotely resembling an economic prosperity that, since at least the Enlightenment was generally associated as a necessary precondition for the progress of sciences and literatures, as Adam Smith put it in The Wealth of Nations. Yet it was early in 1947 that the Politburo of the Soviet Communist Party met to discuss, among other questions, the measures to boost what they called the dissemination of political and scientific knowledge among the population of the USSR. Moreover, from the very beginning, this campaign was designed as a public initiative. Its cornerstone was a new voluntary society, which had to bring together scholars, as well as writers, medical doctors, retired officers. In other words, people who could claim expertise in a certain area of knowledge. The goal of the society was to communicate this knowledge to the public and to create a universal political and scientific literacy. The Communist Party apparatus retained the general supervision and control over the campaign. After all, it was envisioned as kind of integral part of state propaganda. But its organization was delegated to the Society for Dissemination of Political and Scientific Knowledge, which is how this new voluntary organization came to be known. Scientific in the name of the organization is much closer to the German word wissenschaftlich, right? Because it was not limited to just science in the English sense of the word. The party granted the Soviet academic community a great deal of autonomy in communicating to the public scientific, historical, medical, political, economic, and other forms of knowledge. The fact that the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign was launched in 1947, that is 6 years before Stalin's death in 1953, is even a little bit symbolic because it was the same year that George Orwell started working on his famous 1984, that had laid a very strong tradition of imagining Soviet society in terms of institutionalized ignorance. If you remember, ignorance is power is one of the slogans of the party in that novel. And surely enough, there was censorship, restricted access to certain knowledge and political surveillance of public speech throughout the entire Soviet era, and especially during Stalinism. Yet at the same time, the Marxist-Leninist ideology very explicitly stated that socialism and eventually communism could only be built in and by an educated society. As a consequence, Soviet leaders treated the public communication of knowledge as an urgency, as a critical measure to ensure the survival and eventual victory of the socialist bloc in the global confrontation with capitalism, especially as the Cold War progressed into this kind of nuclear standoff. Just one example. When the Society for Dissemination of Political and Scientific Knowledge was founded in 1947, the Soviet academics who were put in charge of it, such as Sergei Vavilov, the president of the USSR Academy of Sciences, here in this slide, they initially wanted to uphold strict criteria regarding who could become the member of the society, and thus science communicator. To become a full member, one needed to be a university faculty or a researcher in the Academy of Sciences, or have some kind of national recognition in his or her field. And that, of course, significantly reduced the pool of members and the coverage of this campaign, limiting it to large urban centers with universities and branches of the Academy of Sciences. And then, just less than 2 years after the launch of this campaign, the propaganda department of the Communist Party submitted a memorandum to its Politburo criticizing the frustratingly slow pace of this campaign. I will cite a short excerpt from it because it suggests a few insights into the organization of the campaign that are important for my talk today. So in this memo, its author, Dmitry Shipilov, criticized the executive board of the society in the following terms. The society has not yet turned into a mass organization of Soviet intelligentsia and has failed to overcome its lack of openness. In our country, there is a huge number of academics, teachers, physicians, agriculturalists, writers and artists, military specialists, engineers who can serve as public lecturers, yet the society failed to achieve a desirable scale of the propaganda of knowledge. The executive board has been primarily focused on the organization of public lectures in Moscow. Moscow-based lectures travel to the periphery very occasionally. Propaganda of knowledge is carried out particularly poorly among workers and peasants. What I find remarkable about this quote is that it's something more than an attempt of the Communist Party officials to tighten their control over the Soviet intelligentsia, which is, for example, Evgeny Dobrenko's argument about the ideological campaign of late Stalinism in his most recent monograph. The persistent references to the people as the ultimate benefactors of Soviet science and culture suggest that at stake was a bigger issue, and that issue was the question of national governance through scientific citizenship. Party bureaucrats were concerned that the original model of science communication left out the working class in the countryside and only benefited educated urbanites, a situation that created a kind of hermetic circle in knowledge communication when educated urbanites were giving lectures to other educated urbanites, something that prevented social progress in the Soviet Union. As a result of this criticism, the original strict admission criteria of who could become a knowledge communicator with the Society for Dissemination of Political and Scientific Knowledge, those criteria were replaced with a much more superficial approach. Now, any college degree was pretty much enough for you to become a member of the society and a knowledge popularizer. Soon it grew to include hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of members of the Soviet intelligentsia who were recruited as part-time public lecturers to speak on political and scientific topics all over the country. All over the country, not only in geographic terms, but also in social terms, everywhere from specialized lecture halls at planetariums, where distinguished Soviet scholars would give lectures to well-educated audiences, to factory workshops and collective farm fields, where local engineers, school teachers, even undergraduate students, right, like the ones present here, from local colleges, such as the University of Vienna, would give lectures to kind of kolkhoz workers after work shifts, or as in this photo, during lunch breaks. To make sure that this campaign would reach, at least potentially, every single Soviet citizen, its organization was modeled after the Soviet Communist Party. Members were recruited from among the Soviet educated class, with a college degree being the main membership requirement. Several members working in the same factory or organization formed so-called primary cells that were responsible for knowledge communication at their workplace or at their home community or district. Almost all factories, many government agencies, even larger collective farms had such primary cells. These cells reported to local or city organizations of the Society for Dissemination of Political and Scientific Knowledge. By the way, at some point they got tired of pronouncing this long name, right? You can hear it from me. And in 1963, they renamed it to radically shorter Znania Society after the Russian word for knowledge. The local and city organizations in turn reported to regional organizations, those to Republican organizations, and then at the very top, the Moscow-based executive committee supervised the overall course of this campaign, as well as the publication of popular science books, brochures, magazines. This centralized structure, coupled with a compulsory peer review of popular science lectures and publications, was designed to implement a thorough control over the knowledge communicated to Soviet audiences. These are some figures that would give you a better idea of the scale of this campaign. You can see in here individual membership, that the number of people who claimed membership in the society, in the Znania society, was rapidly growing to the end of the 1970s, when it briefly reached 3 million. Now, it also gives you an idea that only a fraction of them were active members, while others treated their membership as a mere formality. If you look at the top table, which is based on an archival report from the USSR organization of the Znania society, in the 1956, only between 30 and 50% of its members were active in the public communication of knowledge. The reason why the membership figure for the late 1970s is so huge is that at that time, the campaign managers inflated its numbers to appease the agent of Politburo. At that time, the actual number of members was probably between 10 and 20%, the people who actually communicated knowledge. But nevertheless, think about it, that gives us hundreds of thousands of members of the Soviet educated class who gave actually regularly or occasionally popular lectures on science, history, literature, medicine, and so forth. You can also see the fields of knowledge that this campaign targeted in particular. The topics in history, international relations, and domestic politics dominated quantitatively. But the effort to popularize medicine, natural sciences, and technology was quite substantial as well. Overall, the sheer number of popular lectures and publications that reached Soviet audiences made this campaign arguably the largest science popularization effort of the 20th century. The organizers of the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign, including Stalin himself, definitely assumed that such a tremendous effort should produce a significant trust in official science, medicine, and other forms of knowledge. Stalin, at the end of his life, was obsessed with a political economy textbook. In a conversation with the already mentioned Dmitry Shpilov that I put on this slide, he framed the necessity of this book in terms of a universal economic literacy, right? Our people have to have a thorough grasp of economic theory. If they don't, we're finished. This is a commonplace assumption in modern societies that the more we invest in science communication, the more the public understands and trusts science and scientific authorities, something that is encapsulated in the idea of scientific citizenship. All citizens would act rationally if exposed to the right forms of knowledge. Another name for this assumption is the deficit model of science or knowledge communication, an assumption that the public acts irrationally because it lacks knowledge, has a certain deficit of knowledge. So by communicating science to the public, by economic knowledge to the public, we fill in this deficit and solve the problem of irrational social behaviors. Such visions were definitely the main driving factor in the Soviet mass scientific literacy. Yet when we look at the actual discussions and debates about science in late Soviet society, we observe something quite different from this imaginary picture. In the last decades of the Soviet Union, there was an ever-increasing interest in all things related to alternative forms of knowledge and sometimes straight pseudoscience. In the last chapter of my book, The Things of Life, I discussed the public interest in parapsychology by focusing on Soviet TV psychics who captivated the Soviet public imagination in the midst of the perestroika. The late Soviet press also became flooded with testimonies of UFO sightings and contacts, interactions with poltergeists, and claims of telepathic abilities. Nationalism, religiosity, mysticism, esotericism saw a revival to a scale unseen since the Bolshevik Revolution. Superficially, it looked like the grand failure of Soviet rationality, as if the decades of the mass scientific literacy campaign were in vain. A claim that one could actually hear quite often back in the late 1980s and the last years of the Soviet Union, and can still hear pretty commonly these days. The mass scientific literacy campaign in the Soviet Union could have failed in producing its official goal of universal scientific literacy, but its social and cultural effects were nevertheless multifold and profound, and included the emergence of a new class of professional performers of knowledge, the new audiences of this state propaganda of knowledge, new media forms and techniques of knowledge communication, and new epistemic forms and networks. For example, I recently published an article on how Soviet ufology initially emerged in the Moscow planetarium, and then developed through the infrastructure of the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign. And now it's so interesting, but by this time you should have, at least members of the conference, a very valid and legitimate question. What does it have to do, right, with commodities, trade, and materiality? Where is all of that? And the answer to this question is twofold. One part is that in the Cold War Soviet Union, and by the way, this is something that science popularization in post-Soviet Russia borrowed, inherited as well, popular knowledge itself became a commodity for mass consumption. The thing is that the Soviet government wanted, and rather desperately so, to build a nationwide comprehensive system for the public communication of knowledge. Yet, it did not want to bankroll it from the state budget. The society, the Znania Society, had state subsidies for the first few years of its work, but then it had to become a self-sustaining, self-financing organization. In other words, it had to finance its activities from its own revenues. And the revenues came primarily for public lectures of its members. In the planned state economy, the management of the society, and especially its regional branch officers who had to turn a profit for the executive board, they had to operate basically like a business, recruiting new members, reaching out to local organizations with a portfolio of available lectures, advertising open lecture series through posters and newspapers and so forth. Now, since they reported to the propaganda department of the Communist Party, they could also secure at least a certain number of public lectures and hence revenues as part of the state propaganda network. In this sense, popular knowledge was a commodity, but quite often this commodity came to you whether you wanted it or not. Like, for example, in college dormitories, where local managers often force students to attend lectures on the topics that 18 and 19-year-olds have little interest in, such as family values or communist morality. And that brings us to the second part of the answer, why it is relevant for this conference, the one that I would like to discuss in more detail. The public communication of knowledge in the Cold War Soviet Union was organized as a modern propaganda. As you could see in my quotes, propaganda of knowledge was an absolutely accepted term. Moreover, the people involved in this campaign very proudly called themselves propagandists of knowledge. The word propaganda might have a negative connotation in the English language. I'm not sure about the German language, is it as well? But in the Soviet context, propaganda of knowledge was almost a technical term, describing the state instrumentalization of knowledge and of the educated class to shape social attitudes. Studies of propaganda can be therefore very helpful for our understanding of the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign. And in working on my project, I found particularly useful a book by a French philosopher and sociologist, Jacques Ellul, a former member of the French resistance and then a professor of sociology at Bordeaux. In 1962, Ellul published a book, the English title of which is Propaganda, the Formation of Man's Attitude, where he pointed out that modern propaganda is characterized by continuity, duration, and combination of different media, which is nothing new, because that combination had been extensively discussed in much earlier works, such as Harold Laswell's The Propaganda Technique in the World War, which came out much earlier in 1927. What differed Ellul's work from earlier accounts was his focus on what he called the physicality of propaganda. And here's a quote from his book. A great error which interferes with propaganda analysis is to believe that propaganda is solely a psychological affair, a manipulation of symbols, an abstract influence on opinions. A large number of American studies on propaganda are not valid for this reason. That's a Frenchman. No propaganda is possible unless psychological influence rests on reality, and the recruiting of individuals into caters of movements goes hand in hand with psychological manipulation. As long as no physical influence is exerted by an organization on the individual, there is no propaganda. Such physical organization can be the integration of an entire population into cells by agents in each block of residence. In that case, it operates inside a society by integrating the whole social body. And remember the structure of the Society for Dissemination of Political and Scientific Knowledge, where the basic building blocks were exactly primary cells that would be housed in factories, universities, or collective farms, but could also be organized geographically in local communities. This structure was one aspect of the society that made the Soviet propaganda of knowledge so omnipresent in Soviet society. Now, apparently there was something in the air in the early 1960s about the physicality of propaganda in particular and communication in general. Just a year after Lil's book, Marshall McLuhan published his famous Understanding Media. And a few years before, Roman Jakobson presented at the meeting of the Linguistic Society of America his equally influential model of communication that included physical contact as one of the 6 factors of communication. What is remarkable about Lil's description is his attentiveness to the fact that in order to be effective, propaganda should maintain a close, almost bodily contact with its audience. The internet is the weapon of choice for propagandists these days because laptops and smartphones provide this intimate contact, intimate bodily connection. Back in the Cold War era, and this is something that Lil points out very nicely, a way of waging a successful campaign of propaganda, including in my case, the Soviet epistemic propaganda, was by the physical organization of the city space. Look at this quote by Marietta Shaginian, a loyal Stalinist writer and a high-ranked member of the Soviet literary establishment. Writing in her diary about the final stages of the construction of the main building of the Moscow State University in 1952, she described it as a majestic process that showcased the industrial might of the Soviet Union. After all, I'm not sure if you know it or not, the main building of the MGU became for a number of years the tallest building in Europe. Quite a feat. Yet one thing still concerned her. The original plan was to give all facilities in the main building of the MGU to natural science. And Shaginian considered it deeply flawed. She argued that this marginalization of humanities and social sciences was contradictory to the very concept of the Soviet byt, the organization of daily life. When, and here's the quote, newspapers, radio, lecture halls, popular science documentaries, mandatory courses in Marxism-Leninism for every university student, Marxism itself as the scientific worldview of our culture, provide us with an opportunity to develop and expand any specialized education that we can obtain. Shaginian here is writing in a full socialist realist mode. The triumphant penetration of popular science into the byt that she is describing has not yet happened, right? It's something that is about to happen, that is set to happen. What is interesting here is that Shaginian's reference to the byt involves the interwar discussions that I already mentioned about the new socialist ways of life that were deeply rooted in the materialist understanding of human selves as structured by their daily experiences. Expressed by the figures of Soviet avant-garde, such as Boris Arbatov, and members of the Bolshevik establishment, such as Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's widow, these discussions had a common ground. No radical transformation of Soviet society was possible through psychological propaganda alone without building the material foundations of the new byt. Now, for Arbatov, for Alexander Rodchenko, whose interior design over Workers' Club you see in this photo, for Varvara Stepanova and other early Soviet avant-gardists, it was the new revolutionary art and design that had to become the main organizers of the byt. And the title of my talk, Science into the Byt, is an allusion to their slogan, Art into Life. Meanwhile, for Krupskaya, along with such feminists as Bolshevik feminists as Alexandra Kollontai, Lyudmila Stalin, and many other female leaders and activists, the new byt was about social infrastructure, such as public cafeterias, daycares, and laundries. Shaginian, who was writing 2 decades later in the 1950s, included more knowledge-oriented components for understanding of the ideal Soviet byt. In addition to cafeterias and laundries, the material environment of Soviet people had to encourage them to acquire new knowledge on a daily basis, for example, from popular science lectures and documentaries. In this sense, when early in the Cold War, the Communist Party tasked Soviet knowledge popularizers to reach out to the widest possible audience, The latter had to overcome numerous problems of a purely material nature, such as the lack of publicly accessible spaces for lectures and demonstrations, the organization of local level publishing facilities, and the logistical support for speakers like these often had to travel for tens and sometimes hundreds of kilometers to faraway locations, like collective farms, logging sites, mining camps. To start with, during the first post-war years, Soviet urban planning was a complete chaos. While Soviet architects had grand visions of urban redevelopment, there were few possibilities of implementing them because local authorities and industrial managers often rushed to rebuild their facilities without consulting urban planners. Urban planning was also affected by the ideological campaigns of late Stalinism. In the first couple of years after the war ended, there was a cautious turn to a more citizen-oriented development when some leading Soviet architects tried to revive the concept of the residential complex, the mikrorayon, as the basic city unit combining residential and public service buildings. In 1947, however, this approach came under heavy criticism for being an imitation of American neighborhoods and for allegedly encouraging an individualist lifestyle. Forced to come up with a definition of the socialist urban environment that would distance it from Western counterparts, Soviet urban designers reiterated collectivity as the distinct feature of Soviet urbanity. And that created a curious paradox. The post-war socialist city had to materialize and perform the spectacle of Soviet imperial grandeur through public buildings and spaces, such as late Stalin skyscrapers, even at the price of meager and cramped housing conditions for the overwhelming majority of its dwellers. And recent books by Catherine Zubovich and Anthony Kalashnikov describe this ideological work behind Stalin's architecture. Yet the focus on the social political context, what in Russian they call общественно-политическое содержание of urban spaces, meant that a walk in a post-war socialist society had to be anything different than a purely voyeuristic exercise. The reconstruction of the Soviet museum network illustrates the point in question. Damaged by the warfare, Nazi occupation and evacuation to interior territories, Soviet museums, along with other objects of historical and cultural heritage, were given a priority in post-war reconstruction plans. In fact, in the territories that were liberated by the Red Army during the Battle of Moscow early in 1942, museums such as Leo Tolstoy's Yasnaya Polyana, that you see here in the slide, or Konstantin Tsiolkovsky's house, were restored and reopened for visitors the same year, 1942. In Moscow, where museums were closed in 1941 and their collections partially or wholly evacuated away from the approaching Wehrmacht, the State Polytechnic Museum and the State Darwin Museum of Natural History reopened for the public as early as 1943, even though both museums were hit directly by the bombs during the Battle of Moscow. Immediately following the end of the Second World War, the Soviet authorities and intelligentsia also initiated the creation of new museums. Just one example. In Belarus, a Soviet republic that experienced such an extensive damage from the warfare and occupation that many people had to live in dugout shelters or move to other republics like Karelia. At some point after the war, there were more Belarusians living in Karelia than there were Karelians living in Karelia. For a few years after the war, there were in Belarus museums of regional history and culture, the Krayevedenia museums, were established in 1945 in cities like Gomin, Vitebsk, Pinsk, and Brest. New museums were also opened to celebrate Russian and Soviet scientists' cultural figures. In 1947 alone, the Andrei Rublev Museum was established in Moscow, the Lomonosov Museum in Leningrad, and the Nikolai Pirogov Museum in Vinnytsia. The establishment of the Society for Dissemination of Political and Scientific Knowledge in 1947 only intensified the saturation of Soviet cities with knowledge infrastructure. In the late 1940s, the Society initiated the construction of new planetariums in Kyiv, Stalingrad, and Tomsk using fluted or donated size projectors from the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. The construction of the planetarium in Tomsk shows both the difficulties that Soviet science popularizers faced in the immediate post-war period, but also the persistence to build the material infrastructure for knowledge communication. In 1946, a size projector was brought to the Tomsk State University from Germany as a spoil of war. When a local branch office of the Society for Dissemination of Political and Scientific Knowledge was established the following year, the university donated the projector so that it could be used for the propaganda of knowledge. Initially, however, the Tomsk branch of the society lacked facilities even for public lectures, not to mention a planetarium. And its management engaged in lengthy negotiations with local party committee and municipal authorities. After a while, they received a section of a local museum in the very center of Tomsk, only to find out that it required an extensive renovation, including a roof replacement in order to be put to use. The renovation works were nevertheless completed by 1950, when the Tomsk branch of what would become the Znania Society finally could boast a lecture hall with a capacity of 400 seats and a planetarium with a capacity of 100 seats. The concentration of knowledge in urban centers was facilitated by the reconstruction of the library network, which was among the top priorities in the Soviet post-war cultural policies. In the completely destroyed Stalingrad, for example, the city library moved to a newly constructed building in the city center as early as 1945. In Petrozavodsk, where the local Republican library was partially destroyed and partially looted by the Finnish occupation authorities, its reconstruction was also a priority for local authorities, and the newly rebuilt library was opened in 1947. As a rule, the newly built or rebuilt libraries were placed as centrally as possible to become part of the city center ensembles in order to benefit from the circulation of people in the urban space and maximize the flow of customers. Throughout the entire Cold War period, the most common form of knowledge communication in the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign were nevertheless oral public lectures. So the lecture hall, or lectori, became the most ubiquitous object of knowledge infrastructure in the post-war Soviet Union. After all, museums and planetariums were more expensive to organize and they required a regular staff to run them, while lecture halls were inexpensive and could be used by visiting speakers. All regional branches of the Society for Dissemination of Political and Scientific Knowledge sought to build their own lecture halls as centrally as possible. Sometimes local branch offices of the society shared facilities with the propaganda departments of local Communist Party committees, like, for example, in Petrozavodsk, where it was in the House of Political Education. In larger cities like Tashkent, the society owned its own buildings, like this one in the image. Or in Leningrad, where the House of Scientific and Technical Propaganda was located on Nevsky Avenue, not far from the Museum of Atheism that occupied the former and the future Kazan Cathedral of the Russian Orthodox Church. You can't go any more centrally than this in St. Petersburg. In addition to lecture halls run by the society itself or shared with the propaganda departments of the Communist Party, there were many more of them belonging to factories, collective farms, and municipalities, such as in this photograph of an open-air facility in a municipal park in Moscow. In the countryside, the creation of knowledge infrastructure was facilitated once again by the state post-war prioritization of social political architecture over residential houses. For example, rural clubs were favored in post-war reconstruction plans of the Soviet countryside because Soviet architects envisioned them as the compositional focus of the new Soviet village. Lecture halls were a mandatory part of the rural club, and archival documents of the Society for Dissemination of Political and Scientific Knowledge mentioned the plans to have a lecture hall in every Soviet village as early as 1948. At that time, it was not implemented, but over time, they built up that infrastructure as well. The lecture halls located outside of big city centers acted as mini hubs of local social life by bringing external speakers, they provoked interest in the themes that were promoted in the Soviet knowledge popularization campaign. The lecture halls, museums, planetariums, and other objects of knowledge were, not just out there in the urban space, placing large posters advertising the current and forthcoming lectures and events, as well as advertising them through newspapers and the word of mouth. They were actively seeking to interfere with the circulation of people in the city centers and to interrupt it, transforming pedestrians into knowledge consumers, bringing them into their walls, luring them to attend public lectures or see new museum exhibitions. It is important to note here that the organizers of the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign realized one of the key ingredients of effective propaganda. It had to be repetitive. That is why the organization of popular science or popular political lectures was there was a very clear emphasis on providing them in series. Again, since my archival research was partially in the Republic of Karelia, here's a few examples of lecture cycles that were offered there as part of the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign. On the left, you see lecture series of lectures on the topics in local history of Karelia. On the right, a much later perestroika era lecture series on sexual literacy that I'm not sure it would be possible to announce these days. In Texas, for sure. Local audiences were encouraged to attend the entire series by purchasing season passes rather than buying tickets for separate lectures. In this sense, the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign sought not only to delineate the city space, but also to punctuate the time of its audience. To penetrate into the bid, to become part of the everyday life of Soviet citizens, the propaganda of knowledge had to approach them both in space and time, materially and temporally. Now, to the concluding part of my talk. The Soviet urban development during the Cold War produced a substantial infrastructure for the public communication of knowledge, something through which Soviet ideologists sought to interfere into the very bit, the organization of everyday life of Soviet citizens. Walking through a socialist city, its residents encountered museums, lecture halls, libraries, and clubs that interpolated them as consumers of knowledge. I began my presentation with a short tour to a Soviet bookstore. The extensive publication program of the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign that was supported through the book trade and a well-functioning system of magazine and newspaper subscription saturated the lived space of many Soviet people with popular science magazines and books. The persistent effort of Soviet ideologists and educators to create a think system which incorporated popular science, medicine, history, and other forms of knowledge, incorporated all of them into the bid of Soviet people, was quite successful in this respect. And it would only become stronger with the development of Soviet television that had a notable amount of content devoted to the public communication of scientific and medical knowledge. There was another important aspect of the Soviet mass scientific literacy. Many examples that you saw today came from various ethnic regions of the Soviet Union. In this sense, scientific citizenship produced through the knowledge infrastructure transcended the ethnic and cultural boundaries of the USSR, trying to create a uniform epistemic regime in which the skills to consume scientific knowledge were equally valid in Karelia and Uzbekistan or in Moscow. And yet, and I'm coming back to the main paradox of the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign, if this campaign was so effective, in bringing science into the bid, why did it fail to produce trust in scientific knowledge, in scientific authority, something that we see by the end of the Soviet Union? If we think about the public communication of knowledge in the Soviet Union as a propaganda campaign that created an impressive infrastructure and that ensured an intimate and persistent presence of popular science narratives and ideas among the Soviet population, then why did the rational beliefs enjoy so much popularity by the last decades of Soviet society? An emphasis on the materiality of the Soviet mass scientific literacy campaign suggests that this situation only seems paradoxical. Because the belief that the more we popularize science, the bigger the public trust in science would be, it is itself a wrong premise. The penetration of popular science into the bid did not make Soviet people more likely to trust scientific authorities. It did something different. It taught them to handle ideas as commodities, right? And here we finally come to the topic of our conversation, our conference. It taught them to consume popular science narratives, not necessarily for their scientific accuracy. Definitely, there were many people who took it kind of very seriously, who would become science popularizers themselves, or have a career in sciences. But for many people, it taught them to, consume popular science narratives as entertainment, as a marker of good citizenship, and for the educated class as a practice of class belonging. The physicality of the Soviet system for propaganda of knowledge made its audiences predisposed to new ideas that could and eventually turned out to be dramatically different from the ideological dogma or scientific truths. This observation might provide an important lesson for us here and now. If the public communication of knowledge is organized as a propaganda campaign, its social and cultural effect will be massive. That is for sure. It is just a universal scientific literalist might not necessarily be among them. And I think I'm done. Thank you.
For this brilliant talk, which gives a different view on the Soviet Union, and also maybe being valid for other countries. I mean, as a child, even when I was traveling in Poland, I always wondered about the state history, right? Being that thick. So on the walls, tons of books. I mean, small apartments, completely overfilled. So I think this is a more common feature of.
I forgot to mention that, but each socialist country, with the exception of Yugoslavia, had a similar society, like Urania in East Germany.
I mean, that existed before. There's Urania and then in Vienna, but well, this is then part of the discussion. I mean, the conclusion, in a way, reminded me of the famous, Chernomyrdin. We always tried well, but then it ended up badly. And also, of course, I learned that, okay, family life in Karelia, chapter 5, ends with sexual pathologies. So this was poor Karelians. But of course, there's many other things to take, and indeed that we deal with this as a form of consumption that I found interesting. I'm not a specialist in the history of consumption, but it's definitely original, because usually the history of consumption is always dealt with in these kind of Western perspectives on the mass consumption of lessons. So that I found very remarkable, besides the basic and empirical story, of course, and all the effort put into that, and the idea to connect it as a kind of citizenship, while you also, of course, stressed that this was mostly urban, and they tried to spread it to the rural landscape, to rural Russia. Now, there's, of course, the question, the rural-urban division being so huge, especially in the Soviet Union, then obviously this might be a point of discussion. But with that, I will stop and just open the floor. This was just an attempt to foster discussion. Okay, start.
Okay, so actually following it directly on this slide. So first of all, thank you. This was absolutely fascinating. I've been kind of following your project from afar. This is by far the most detailed exposition that I've heard. And even though, I mean, Philip just mentioned the distinction between urban and rural, and of course the talk that you gave focuses on the urban aspect. But actually, I would suggest that a lot of it does apply to rural areas. So I have read, I mean, dozens, if not hundreds, of reports by agitation and propaganda departments concerning rural areas on Republican and oblast level, in places like Moldova, but also Golubev Oblast in Belarus, in the mid-1940s to early 1950s. And even though technically that was usually not about science propaganda, it was just about propaganda and tool, I mean, structurally, so much of what you're describing was already there, was already in place. The lists of lecture topics, the infrastructure with the houses of culture and the libraries and the rural club, etc. The complaints that they don't have enough propagandists with the requisite knowledge or the, for example, the language skills in the Moldovan case, things like that. And also this sort of, I don't know how to call it, cross contamination, where from the top-down perspective, these propagandists are expected to spread kind of positive, Soviet-approved knowledge. But really, there's a lot of kind of hybridization where, instead of organizing a Victory Day celebration, the local propagandist joins an Orthodox march to pray for rain, things like that. Or just something I heard recently in Moldova. Okay, I will allow you the Orthodox procession about praying for rain. I will allow you this procession, but only if you can produce a barometer that will show me that rain is actually imminent, so that I can combine your prayer with, right? So it's actually, I think, not just an urban historian. I would be curious to hear from you about where you see the continuity, because it's kind of the story of propaganda aimed at the mostly rural population of the Soviet Union is, of course, something that started in the 1920s, right, with the Izbich, etc. So I'm wondering, because you started really in the 40s, essentially. Do you see a break? Or do you think that there was really kind of continuity between early, let's say, political propaganda and then the science propaganda?
It's an excellent question. It's a good observation that actually contradicted to what your boss just said about, the big break. So it's allowed here, right? Anyway, back to your comment. Isn't everything a break and a continuity? At the same time, it was a continuity in the sense that it was about literacy, right? It was about the extension of literacy. And in the 1920s, it was a question of basic literacy. And then, as we go into the second half of the 20th century, it's about advanced forms of literacy, right? Advanced form of political literacy, scientific, medical knowledge, and so forth. So in this sense, the continuity is in this effort to create universal literacy. The break is that from now on, they kind of assume that, people in the countryside know how to read. And if Nikolai Mitrokhin were around, he would say that, no, that's not true. Let's say we assume that they're right, and then kind of they switch to the more advanced forms of literacy, propaganda or communication of literacy. And yes, this effort eventually spread into the countryside. One reason why I wanted to emphasize the kind of the urban infrastructures that I started in the late 1940s, and there the kind of emphasis was squarely on the urban infrastructure, right? Because simply they had to, their budget was limited, and they prioritized, let's say, first the creation of infrastructure in Petrozavodsk, and then they move into smaller towns such as Sigerzha and Kondopoga. And then they move into the kind of the Lespромkhozy, right, the Piazersky and so forth. But yes, there was this idea that it's a universal literacy campaign, so definitely could not avoid. It could not avoid rural areas.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. And I have two little intertwined questions. First, I'm interested to what extent, or whether at all, we are planning to explore those relations between the Soviet society and those in the Eastern European country. I am asking because I know of the very same established in Czechoslovakia by a person who spent a lot of time and training in the USSR, not in the Soviet Union, right? And I'm that person was actually not like a very important person in that society, but he actually substantially influenced the whole field of technology and anthropology in the 50s. He was a very influential person. So my question is, if you consider, or if you can talk a little bit about potential impact of these societies, not only on the public or the particular the rural community, but also on scientific community. If you explore that or not.
It's $1 million question. in the sense that the basic premise of my book is that there is no border. There's no border between society. There's no delineated border, right? Kind of ivory tower is an illusion. There is a continuum of science communication between science and society. And as I invoked Roman Jakobs, right? His communication kind of model. It suggests that you can't communicate to society without modifying your own message, right? You cannot communicate, you cannot translate knowledge and not change the way you think about it. Each time I give a talk, I rethink how to use my own example. I rethink how I think about this project. So definitely there was a huge kind of feedback that affected kind of Soviet scientists in multiple ways, in history, in social sciences and humanities in particular. But again, I mentioned I published an article on ufology. Many people who were scientists and started giving, well, not many, but a few of them, started giving popular science lectures, and at some point discovered ufology themselves. Guess who they became? They became ufologists. They became some of the leading, like Felix Ziegel, for example, one of the kind of members, a faculty member at the Moscow Planetarium. There are several other names. So definitely, there was kind of this feedback. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
You're next, right?
Yes. Thank you very much for telling us all about this. And I was wondering, since you talked about primarily about in-person transmission of knowledge, either having to visit a museum or a planetarium, or the lecturer going to visit you, and then you briefly mentioned that eventually television programs had this same took on the same project, and just thinking about the parallels in Hungary, I was wondering what was going on the radio. What was the radio actively involved in sort of recorded versions of these lectures, or was it seen as less efficient since radio ownership was in China? Or
so there were different genres. So again, let me see if I can find it quickly. That's not quick. Okay, here we are. There were different genres. So it's a bad idea to broadcast a recorded public lecture, right? Although I do enjoy listening to podcasts, which is in a way, but kind of I'm not a general audience in a sense. But they do come up with genres, with new kind of forms. They have radio programs that, especially in the field of medicine, right? Well, medical knowledge, communication of medical knowledge. They have a bunch of programs to kind of propagandize medical knowledge or education. That's another thing. So yes, they do conquer radio. There are a number of shows on the radio, only in different formats, not in the form of public lectures.
I don't know. Yeah, that's true.
Right. We've had the question about rural urban. We've had a question about, or a reference to other countries. What about different republics? So, I mean, you had images from Tashkent at some point. Misha mentioned Moldova and the language issues. So to what extent was this campaign conducted also in Republican or even non-Republican minority languages? And or to what extent was it actually a vehicle of Russification?
So, see, you are hitting at the nerve of, I think, one of the crucial conversations in the field in general, right? Not just in this problem. The question between, imperialism, Russification, these sort of things, and the idea about scientific citizenship as a quintessentially modernist idea, right? And there is a huge tension between them, because if you imagine an ideal scientific citizen, right, in terms of this campaign, if we put aside the concrete, like abstract and vague vacuum, scientific citizen, it's somebody who doesn't have a race or ethnicity. Somebody, right? This is kind of an ideal consumer of knowledge, and that ideal consumer of knowledge this is kind of subject position if we think in Michel Foucault's term. And that ideal consumer of knowledge could come from Karelia, could come from Uzbekistan, could come from kind of any regional and ethnic background. So there's that. Then, of course, it is carried out in multiple languages. And they do, like in Karelia, they initially have a separate Finnish language section. And then there are publications in it, right? In other republics, there is even more of that. So definitely there is that sort of particular aspect of propaganda. And this is something I have to research in more detail. But 2 years ago, I was a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, and I had a Ukrainian undergraduate research assistant. And she started taking interviews for me with the former lecturers of Znania Society. And it's tough to be an undergraduate student, and especially it's tough to be an undergraduate student at Harvard. She dropped out at some point, but before she dropped out, she made a very interesting observation. She said that the people whom she interviewed, they became very active in the nation-building project in post-Soviet Ukraine, right? And this is something that I also kind of see in my Karelian materials, because kind of see what sort of lectures they have here. They have lectures kind of that I can totally imagine in different conditions would become the foundation of a regionalist ideology. And quite many people actually, they became regionalist in their ideology, who came out from the Karelian branch of the Znania Society. So there is this tension, and kind of I'm aware of this tension. I still have to conceptualize it for myself in some kind of terms. But this is one of I think the most important questions.
Thank you. I think you were first.
Okay.
So maybe that, you know, that's the in Russian. And I will-
My not enough, because that's why I need to go play. Алексей, меня очень интересует вот какой вопрос. У меня впечатление, что вы в основном говорите о каких-то властной индоктринации в быт, я так скажу, да, Миша?
So my question is this: I have the impression, listening to you, that you're mostly talking about the authorities trying to indoctrinate the everyday life that you described as good.
Потому что как мы можем сравнивать, например, я сейчас буду долго говорить, но тем не менее, мы можем сравнивать прогрессистский быт большевиков, Миш.
So how can we compare the progressivist view that the Bolsheviks took of with
С их представлением о бесконечном новаторстве опыта, представлением о новаторстве
which
опыта,
implied an idea of constantly innovating experience of everyday life,
при этом потенциально имеющего общее мировое значение, да?
and
Опыта.
which at least potentially was going to extend worldwide.
И позднесоветский быт,
And late Soviet everyday life,
рассчитанный на блат,
which was tied intimately to the informal practices known as blood,
теневую экономику,
the shadow economy,
постоянный поиск импортных вещей,
the constant search for imported goods,
югославской мебели,
Yugoslav furniture,
польской и чешской посуды,
Polish and Czechoslovak plates,
немецкого текстиля.
German textile products.
В этом позднесоветском обществе подавляющее большинство населения считает быт отсталым.
So in that late Soviet society, the vast majority of the population thought that everyday life was retrograde,
Неудовлетворительным,
was unsatisfactory,
более того, невыносимо тоскливым,
and was terribly boring and depressing.
воплощением отсталости страны.
An expression of the lack of modernity.
Это первое. Второе. Прогрессивный быт первых десятилетий, да, прогрессивный быт первых десятилетий, который предполагает новую общность.
So the second point is that the progressive idea of everyday life in the first decades of the Soviet project, which implied a new kind of community.
Да, включение во всеобщий эксперимент с формами социальной жизни. Всеобщий эксперимент.
Всеобщий, в смысле,
Global.
общемировой.
Нет,
Или который
общесоциальный. Общесоциальный.
Which
Универсальный, да, универсальный.
which affected the universal experience of life, all of life.
With the forms of life, with experience of life. И поздний советский быт,
And in contrast, the late Soviet experience of
в
everyday life,
котором все уже прояснено,
where everything has already been clarified,
и не остается места для того, что тогда же называется творчеством масс. Не остается места для реального, а не номинального творчества масс.
where there is no longer any space for the creativity of what at the time was called the creativity of the masses.
Да, это же центральное понятие брежневского периода, да, замечу. Все это остается центральным, творчество масс.
Which was a central concept of the Brezhnev period.
Так вот, если смотреть на две эти эпохи, да, первую экспериментальную и поздний совет, говорим ли мы все-таки о целеполагании власти или о том самом творчестве масс?
So to compare these two periods, the first decades of the Soviet project and the late Soviet period, are we talking about top-down objectives of the authorities or something that emerged out of the creativity of the masses?
В чем творчество масс для вас выражается? Реально.
How do you personally think the creativity of the masses express themselves?
Есть ли какие-то для вас периоды, когда существует возможность говорить о низовых представлениях? Низовых представлениях.
О чем?
Низовых представлениях о научном миропонимании, прошу прощения.
So do you think there was actually any period where we can really talk about grassroots ideas, grassroots perceptions of
Scientific goals, scientific, я не могу.
I think it's
С которыми власть вынуждена считаться. Вынуждена считаться.
Ideas that the authorities were forced to take into account.
Независимо от своего желания навязать ортодоксальные марксистские представления о мире, о науке, об обществе.
Regardless of the authorities' desire to enforce their ideas of Marxism onto the masses.
Okay.
I should have replaced water in my bottle with something different during the lunch. That would help me answer this question. In short, I'll answer in English. Then
I understand.
in case you're not satisfied, I will repeat that after the conference informally. This is about it's a social engineering question. It's a social engineering project. No questions asked about it. And in this presentation, I'm not speaking about this creativity of the masses. What I'm speaking about is about the desire to produce scientific literacy through material infrastructure. Now, the problem is that material infrastructure, and in general, that's, by the way, that's one of the key that's one of my key findings in this project, is that the Soviet authorities think about the public communication of knowledge as a medium, as a medium through which we will educate the masses. Makes sense, right? What does Marshall McLuhan tell us about media? The medium is the message, right? That this campaign acquired its own logic. This campaign acquired its own goals in a way. This campaign provided space for epistemic diversity, for many things that we cannot reduce to this kind of властный заказ, right? To the ideological order. And that kind of that became prominent in the way it shaped late Soviet society, including late Soviet byt. Because again, I think it's a stereotype that everybody in the Soviet Union was after Yugoslav furniture, or I don't know. I think there were quite many people, and that's what I find curious about it. I think this campaign, one of the things that it created this ideal subject position, to which some of the people were drawn, which some other people recognize, even though they might not necessarily turn themselves into consumers of knowledge, but they would still recognize that as an acceptable subject position. And in this sense, it became part of social engineering, part of the daily experiences. Well, because I bet you did have at least some of these brochures published by the Znania Society at home, right? And many people, I mean, many of the ideas that became part of daily realities, at least in the Soviet educated class, and you see, I intentionally emphasize the educated class as the biggest target audience of this propaganda. They were shaped by them, like ideas about the early development of children, right? A huge thing in the late Soviet Union comes from the brochures of the Znania Society. That's just one example. So we will continue. I see you are not satisfied.
Okay, thanks a lot. Then there was a question.
It was a slide with a TV slide, right? And I wanted to ask if many people like believe in things like homeopathy or alternative medicine, numerology, astrology, stuff like that.
It was a nation of 180 million people. So yes, there were many people that believed in this sort of stuff. How many though, I can't tell you.
Because in the German areas like Germany, Switzerland, Austria, we have quite a lot of people also believe in, I would say, alternative science.
Yeah.
Homeopathy and astrology.
So here's one example. Have you heard of Erich von Däniken?
Yeah, this is alien.
Yeah. So, oh really? So in 1970, a film came out based on his Erinnerungen an die Zukunft, I think the name of the book, right? Or maybe that was the name of the film, I don't remember. And in 1973, the Soviet, I think it was committee, right? Soviet Committee for Film, they bought it for the Soviet, to show in Soviet cinemas. 1973, right? It did not receive a single positive review in specialized literature, yet it became the single most popular science film in Soviet cinematography. So I think that's one way to think about it, right? The scientists were, they were asking questions, how could we purchase this film to show for the mass audiences? Well, they did purchase it, and it became the most popular among all popular science films at that time. That's the thing about the public communication of knowledge. It does create this kind of market of knowledge, but it might not necessarily satisfy this market with established knowledge, with scientific truth. I think there was Sergey for quite a while.
Now we have to collect, yes.
Yeah, I'll be good. You introduced two kind of metaphors to organize material. So you talk about propaganda of knowledge through knowledge understood as commodity, right? So you mentioned all that. And then you have a kind of continuing metaphor. You're talking about scientific citizenship. The two models don't sit nicely with each other, right? So one implies citizenship implies loyalty, and commodity implies highly individualized interests and pleasures. So I'm not quite sure how you bring the two together. You don't quite explain. Hold on. You don't quite explain the contradiction between the two. It might be not important. And I want to add one more metaphor to talk. What you described the materiality is awfully close to the basic missionary campaign from where the 19th century happened. Right, the Comoros have a few studies explaining how to get European missionaries who would proselytize there by building obviously churches, creating Sunday schools, and then once you have the dominant worldview, you get all kinds of heresies, dissidents. In other words, like the infrastructure is very, very similar to what you're doing, what you're showing. Yet somehow this model, explanatory model, is not a part of your vocabulary. So help me understand all these multiple frameworks of the results.
Can we take one more?
Maybe I'll reply.
Okay.
I think I made it out of 2 presentations, so that might be one reason why there are 2 competing frameworks. But actually, no, seriously, I borrow it from, in a way, I'm trying to describe what I find in my archival sources. And in my archival sources, I encounter these visions of kind of scientific citizenship, right? That we will now satisfy this knowledge deficit and we'll have people act rationally. And we have, and that is especially the executive board, that is the people who kind of like Vavilov, who plan the campaign. And then we have people who have to run this organization. And they have to make the ends meet because they don't have funding from the state budget. They have to get the revenues. And in this sense, they do sell knowledge. They do market, or at least market it. They do offer it to local organizations. They do offer it to the public through, they advertise. They advertise not only in posters, but they advertise in newspapers, right? So in this sense, it is not just a metaphor. I think this is the way they treat knowledge, like very sincerely.
So colleges do the same.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's why they are Scientologists.
Please.
I pick up partly on that point, but also going back to the what kind of knowledge are we talking about, and the psychic in the 80s, and also this what you described, you know, at the same time, it's like this kind of Cold War rationality that's present in, you know, everywhere, and it's partly this nation building, and I get these, you know, the materiality and the concept, but it also connects to other materialities and what happens when the kind of knowledge that is disseminated or is not successfully disseminated goes against other aims of the state. And for instance, in the 80s, we have like the rise of the, you know, the UFO stuff and the kinds of other, you know, alternative things, theories that they're painting. We also have a really big plummeting of vaccination rates. And that is a very serious problem for the state. And that is in the same kind of scientific communication category. So how does that play out? That these seem to be opposing?
No, they're not. That's the thing. They're not opposing. One of the best books on vaccine hesitancy that I read recently is by Bernice Hausmann. It's called Anti-Vax. It's about the current vaccine hesitancy. She's a professor at the Penn State, and she published it in 2019. And in 2020, the COVID started, and she just could not stop giving interviews. Basically, that you could not publish a book better, you know, at a better moment. And she's saying that it is completely wrong. And that's for me in art. It's completely wrong to perceive vaccine hesitancy in terms of obscurantism.
No, that's not what
Right?
I'm saying at all. No, and that argument has been made way before
Yeah,
that. Sociologists. But that there's an alter, you know, there is a lot of research going into it and a lot of, you know, in vaccine hesitancy and rejection. But it goes against that, the knowledge and the science that is built on.
Oh,
it goes
I see.
against the objective of the state to have a high vaccination rate. That's what I'm.
Because you have to narrativize knowledge, because you can't communicate facts, you communicate stories. And the stories, once they're out there are people who work with stories better than we, so the scientists, right? Even social scientists, even historians. So in this sense, I think this is kind of in the nature of the public communication of science, that we have to narrativize science. I mean, in history, we do narrativize it anyway, right? Not necessarily in biology, although there are scholars who argue that even in those sciences, narrativization is the basic sort of aspect of scientific work. But again, you have these narratives, and it is kind of one thing to work with facts. It's another thing to work with narratives.